Hi, Misha here, and we are finally here at the T-72, at least originally nicknamed the Ural after its factory in the Ural Mountains. And this is a continuation of kind of the Design Bureau competition, i.e. fight, that had been going on in Russia for a couple of decades. And this is quite possibly one of the most successful Soviet-era tanks. Now, only about 25,000 were built, which sounds kind of small and big at the same time. Compared to previous tanks like the T-34 and T-54-55, that doesn't seem so much. But, we talked about the T-64 and the T-80, with those only being built 13,000 and around 8,000 respectively. So it is more than that, and compared to a lot of Western tanks, it's a vastly large number. The fact is, these are getting more expensive, and of course, that just changes things. But, unlike the T-62 and the T-80, this was quite the successful export. Very much like the T-54-55, with over 40 countries using it, many of them still having it today. In fact, it's still very much in Russian service, at least the updated version, the T-72B3, aka the T-72BM. So we've got three models here. We've got a Iraqi one here from Forces of Valor. We've got a Model Collect here. And we've got, I forget, Altea or Atlas, they're all the same, here. And I believe this one is mislabeled. They have it as labeled as a T-72M1, but that's an export model, and it is labeled Russian. I think they meant to put T-72A or AV, but we'll get to that. So, I guess we'll just go ahead and dive on in. This will be a general overview. I'm not even going to attempt to give all the details and variants of this tank, or we would be here a very long time. Let's put this one on the spinny thingy, but for right this moment, let's bring out the T-62 and the T-64 again as a bit of a refresher. The T-62 was an evolutionary step forward for the T-55, but it wasn't a major step. It had improvements, namely its smooth-bore 115mm gun. The T-64 from the Morozov Bureau, creator of the T-34 and the original T-54, was considered a high-technology tank. The reason they went with the T-62, the Object 165 and 166 were ready to go in 1961, whereas the Object 430 was ready, but just didn't look to be that much better. Now, both teams had better designs scheduled. The team here, that would be from the Ural factory, had the Object 167, which had a improved chassis and an upgraded engine, some more power going on, because this was a little slow using the same engine as the T-54-55. And the Morozov Bureau had the Object 432, which was a great leap forward. But they needed something now. The Object 166 was good enough, so they adopted it. They did not go for the 167. But it wouldn't be long before the Object 432 was ready, and it would be put into production in 1963 and adopted into service in 1966. Unfortunately, it proved to be quite costly, and the early versions weren't that reliable. It had an all-new diesel engine that was much more compact. It had an alloy suspension system to save weight. But it did have a nice big 125mm smooth-bore gun, and it would later feature updated armor. It had composite armor with steel, aluminum steel, later steel, fiberglass steel. That was a good idea. So a lot of good ideas, but it did have issues. And not just with the design, but with production. This new fancy engine, well, the factory wasn't ever able to make enough. So that was kind of the choke point. They just couldn't make enough T-64s that they wanted, meaning the T-62, it's kind of one reason it was kept in production. It wasn't an export success like they'd hoped, but they kept it around because they just didn't quite have enough T-64s, and this was a good, simple tank. This was typically used to support motorized infantry, whereas this was used to support armored tank divisions. But there was an opportunity here. Now, Morozov had successfully kind of kept designs from eclipsing his throughout the 1960s, but his influence started to wane as Khrushchev would leave and the Brezhnev administration would come in, and therefore the other design bureau, OKB, the Ural factory, saw an opportunity. They could maybe make a tank that would be a little more conventional. Essentially, they started off with a T-64 hull, but trying to put a more conventional diesel engine, like from the T-62, in it. And this was known as the T-64 mobilization model. The idea was, hey, we can produce this in case of war using another engine. They also looked at upgunning things, but they realized quite quickly the T-64 chassis, because of its lightweight frame and built for a different engine, really wasn't going to do well with the more conventional, heavier diesel engine. It was going to have stress fractures and what have you. So they did have to go back to the design board, or rather an old design. They revisited the Object 167, which they had built a couple of prototypes of earlier before it was abandoned, and its larger chassis and all that good stuff. And so they would play around with it, introducing some of the new technologies from the T-64, but again, a more conventional engine, and it would have the larger 125mm gun that was coming into vogue. Now, the T-64 had an autoloader, which reduced the crew to 3. This was something that the Soviets were really getting fond of. So this new version would also have a crew of 3, but it would use a different autoloader. It was actually a design that the Ural board there had kind of dreamt up back around 62, 63 as an alternative to the system used in the T-64 and later T-80. And it could handle the larger 125mm. So that's kind of the main thing. We have the larger chassis frame of the Object 167, and we have this new loading system and gun. It was eventually all combined into the Object 172, beginning around 1968, with initial testing starting that year. Now, officially at this time, the powers that be were still satisfied with what they had. So this was only a developmental thing to create a mobilization tank that could be built quickly and easily during wartime in the event of war. So this was not something they were planning for frontline service or even to build in large numbers. It was just a just in case type thing. So they would continue testing and what have you. And then around 1970, there would be a series of updates, namely to the suspension system, but a few other little tweaks. And this would be the Object 172M. And by this point, the designs are really coming along quite well. And in 1971, a limited production series, really prototypes or pre-productions, came out of the factory for more testing, field trials, and this would lead to a few more tweaks to the overall design. But interestingly, at the beginning of 1972, the government kind of reversed policy and allowed for the T-72 to go into production, actually placing order for a few hundred. I think they saw this as a potential successor to the, at that time, failing T-62, and of course the very successful T-54-55, to be a more dependable, simpler tank compared to the 64 and 80 inside Russia, more equipped the masses, and what have you. So yeah, policy change, it happens. So the Eurofactory was ordered to cut back on T-64 production and other things and retool and get ready to go with the new tank, which was tested and then formally adopted into the Red Army in August of 1973 as the T-72 Ural. And to be honest, it had a bit of a rocky start. Even though rate production was authorized in 1973, only 30 tanks were built that year. In 1974, things didn't really improve. They were only able to produce about 150, maybe 200 tanks that year. The problem was the government had ordered over 400. They discovered that the factory was using a lot of dated tooling, didn't have enough tooling, so there was a bit of a modernization done there. And this also gave them the opportunity to have several early rounds of updates for the tank. Not uncommon for Russian hardware. You see it from many things from pistols and rifles to jet aircraft. They kind of like to do small rate production to work out the bugs, and then once they get that, the second or third version they'll make many of. For example, they would introduce a laser rangefinder quite early on. They would upgrade the gun and engine several times, and it would soon get the kind of composite armor that the T-64A was sporting. This would all result around 1979 in the T-72A, which is the one that really saw widespread production. It was also exported as the T-72M, like a lot of Russian stuff had downgraded hardware and what have you. And that's what we have here, a Russian T-72A, despite the marking on the plinth. And what makes this tank what it is? Well, size-wise, it's like a lot of Russian tanks, around 9.5 meters. It's pretty lightweight for its day and time, around 41 to 42 tons for the fully armored up version. This could actually drop down to about 38 tons for some of the export models that lacked some of the more advanced hardware. It had a crew of 3. It was NBC protected, as you'd imagine. It has pretty standard 125 millimeter smooth bore main gun. Although, like I said, it does have a unique auto loader system. It has 2 cylindrical cylinders that contain a 2-part charge, one for the round itself, one for the charge, and this is all loaded automatically and ejected and all that. In fact, there's not much left once it fires except a little bit of a plate. But yeah, it's a different autoloader system, but it seems to be reliable. It has a 7.62 machine gun coaxially mounted, and then by this time having a 12.7 heavy machine gun on the turret is standard. Interestingly, it tends to face backwards compared to the other tanks. It did have a pretty good top speed. Depending on which model, you're looking at 60 to 70 kilometers, so about 37 to 47 miles per hour. Because of its lightweight, it has a relatively conventional diesel engine, but it had good mobility and it would be improved over time. It should be pointed out that this had quite a bit greater range endurance than the T-80 that was coming around about the same time. So there was a good incentive there. In a lot of ways, it was a very standard tank, and that's why it really ended up being so darn successful. It was just a tank, it did tank things. And it was relatively affordable, it was easy to operate, several versions and variants were created. They would have a version of the T-72A known as the T-72AV. This was the first time it had reactive armor, the earliest Contact 1 type. It would also be able to launch anti-tank guided missiles out of the gun, things of that nature. Of course, there were command tank versions issued. and what have you. And of course, it would leave its production issues behind as we get into the 1980s. Even though it was kind of the underdog, it ended up being quite a bit more successful than either the T-64 or the T-80, which is, that's historical irony for you. And they would continue to do a lot of things, add smoke generators, move them around, reinforcing the side armor, kind of going to different types of skirts and whatnot. Interestingly, there's this kind of V-shaped thing in the front here. If I move my gun, I'll pick up another one. There we go. Right here. Usually if that's visible, that means there's not explosive reactive armor installed. Just a good, solid tank. And that's why not only Russia purchased this, again for more rank and file units, but it was exported quite widely. I should say that the T-72A was never deployed to Afghanistan in the 1980s by Russia. Instead, they sent T-55s and T-62s, keeping the new T-72s and eventually T-80s for European and Russian use. However, one we should probably talk about, Iraq. Here we have what's referred to as the Lion of Babylon on the spinny thing. Like I said, this is a model from Forces of Valor. A very nice little die-cast model, pretty much all metal. Has a lot of moving parts too. They do a good job with their 172 scale tanks. It even has actual working wheels and tracks. Iraq was a pretty major user even before their war with Iran. They would purchase some directly from Russia, and they would assemble their own with a few domestic changes to suit the environment using Russian parts and kits. This is where the Lion of Babylon. It also was kind of nicknamed the Saddam tank because in the Iraq-Iranian War, this showed very well. It was respected, even feared. In its first major engagement, it went up against a big grouping of chieftains that the Iranians had and obliterated them, wiping them out, and no T-72s were lost. And it continued to do well throughout the 8 years of the war. Iraq only lost about 60 T-72s, again, so that's fewer than 10 a year. And that's compared to the fact that Iran started with nearly 900 chieftains and ended the war with just over 200. These also went up against some older U.S. tanks like the M47 and M48 Patton. And they quickly discovered that the 105mm round just could not penetrate the front armor of the T-72. Even without the reactive armor, the front armor on these, especially later versions, was actually thicker than that on other tanks, including the T-80. The T-80 really was relying more on reactive armor, though, so it's not exactly fair. The 125mm gun did very well, and it was well respected. And Iraq would receive about 1,038 total, including Russian and domestically assembled. And they would continue using them, of course, after the war in 1990. Saddam sent roughly 700 tanks in to invade Kuwait. These were a mix of T-55s, T-62s, and, T-72s kind of at the spearhead. And again, they did well. A couple were lost or damaged, but all in all, they showed themselves quite well. Interestingly, Kuwait had a handful of T-72s themselves, and this would not be the only time it would be kind of the same tank on tank. But the run of luck would end in 1991 with the Gulf War, January, February, against the coalition, the Allies. the T-72s got owned by the M1 Abrams and the British Challenger, amongst others, really through no fault of their own. For one thing, the 72M and 72M1, that's the upgraded version, export models just didn't have the good armor protection. They didn't have the explosive armor like the later Soviet versions. They often had less sophisticated sighting systems, even less sophisticated ammunition options. So it's not really fair. But these would continue in Iraqi service after the war. Around 95-96, they had over 750 still in the Iraqi army. And of course, these would again be deployed in 2003 during the Second Iraq War, and would continue with the new Iraqi government. In fact, 2009-2010, they were interested in purchasing 2,000 upgraded T-72 versions. And by that time, while actual production was over in Russia, upgrade packages were being sold by Russia and other nations. These were infinitely upgradable, still are today. It's just a simple, reliable tank design. That's why it did work in the desert so well. It had many of the same shortcomings as other Russian tanks: limited depression and even elevation of the main gun, cramped interior, kind of a rudimentary tiller-style steering system versus newer methods. The thermal systems were kind of secondary or sourced from third parties. But this was the most prolific second-generation main battle tank in the Warsaw Pact. It was exported to pretty much all the members. It was produced under license in both Poland and Czechoslovakia. And it was exported afield, not just to Iraq, but to places like Finland and Yugoslavia, and quite interestingly, India, which kind of explains why India was so keen on the T-90 we talked about several videos ago. It really did get kind of spread around the world, which is pretty neat. But of course, while the T-72A and M would kind of remain the standard for several years, by the 1980s, new technology existed, and so upgraded versions would end up being produced. And our last tank today is a T-72B. Introduced in 1985, this was kind of the first major step forward. It had better composite armor protection. Also, the turret was rearranged, moving the smoke generators from the front to the side to allow for explosive armor tiles to be more easily applied. We had an updated version of the same basic gun that could fire newer guided missiles. We had an improved, upgraded engine for improved mobility. Of course, we had better sighting systems, fire control systems, kind of the usual. It's a pretty standard update package, and that's not a bad thing. At this point, we're starting to verge away. This was originally considered a second-generation main battle tank. Soon we'll be kind of verging into third generation. And it should be said that the export version was the T-72S. The major difference, the T-72B that Russia used had the full armor package, be it composite or reactive armor. In fact, NATO would later, after the thaw and the Cold War in the 90s, determine that it was a very effective armor system that would have been hard for NATO guns at the time to penetrate. But since they'd only been fighting export 72Ms or 72Ss, they had a bit of an underappreciation for the T-72's armor. And the uprated diesel engine just made this a further better option for a lot of users compared with the T-80. Remember, at this time, Ukraine was even introducing the T-80UD with a diesel engine, just getting away from the gas turbine. It did allow this to be a more flexible tank. And while other users would deploy these, Russia would actually wait. These would not see active combat in Russia until the end of 1994 with the First Chechen War. They, along with the T-80, were deployed there originally in a lot of urban situations to try to take urban areas, and they failed rather spectacularly. A total of 62 tanks were lost in only a couple of months, 3 months at most, of fighting. And while you can point out some flaws in the tanks, mainly the T-80, it was mostly tactics. The T-72, 44 were lost compared to 18 of the T-80, but to be fair, more T-72s were there. Now, their frontal armor was holding up quite well. What the enemy would have to do would have kind of anti-tank teams come, and they would typically swarm one tank with multiple teams, hitting it with RPGs, usually 7s, sometimes later versions. They would also be equipped with machine guns to kind of harass the crew. And it would take, Russian studies said, 3 to 6 hits to knock one out, usually having to come in from the top, the sides, or the rear, kind of avoiding the front because the armor was simply too thick. Now, once Russia realized their tactics were just piss poor, they changed them up midway through 1995, giving better infantry support, usually having the infantry kind of go ahead of them in certain areas, and this greatly reduced tank losses in the remaining part of that war. And they were again deployed in the Second Chechen War. And unlike the T-80 that wasn't sent, these were sent in 2008 into Georgia. Interestingly, there they would fight large numbers of Georgian-controlled T-72s. Now, at this time, we are starting to see some update packages. The Ural factory would discontinue principal T-72 production around in 1992. That's just kind of how things were going in Russia post-Soviet Union. The only 2 tanks really being made were the T-80U, and this would evolve into the T-90, which started off being kind of known as the T-72UB, BU, and later BM. So it really didn't end, because the T-90 is a T-72 in a lot of ways. In fact, one of the first update packages introduced around 1999-2000, turn of the millennium, because everyone had to do updates around then, Windows. The T-72 BA package. The B1 was actually back in the 80s. It was a version that did not fire anti-tank missiles from the main gun. Sorry about that. This would be the BA, T-72 BA, and it would offer an uprated engine. It would offer an improved main gun to kind of keep it modern, and it would continue to update protection and all that good stuff. It would also have the same tracks that were being put on the new T-90, so we're starting to see a little bit of technology exchange here. But that was a pretty modest step forward. Let's put the T-90 on the stand so we can kind of compare. Next came the T-72 B2 upgrade package, offered starting in 2006, and this was more comprehensive. It had further updates to the weapons. It featured a thermal sight, although at this time it would have to be sourced using some foreign components. It had modern communications gear to some extent. It had a further upgraded engine, and it used what were considered to be third-generation reactive armor tiles. So really kind of getting on. And this is really when I would say the T-72 ceases to be a second-generation and definitely is more of a third-generation MBT. It just better protection, newer equipment, And the Russian army did not purchase it. But of course, they were purchasing the T-90, so it makes sense. But they had a lot of T-72s in inventory, so they're going to have to do something with them. They knew this. So, 2011, around the same time that T-90 orders or T-90A orders were ramping down, the factory came out with a third update package known as the T-72B3. And a lot of these, either B2, B3, are often called the T-72BM for modernized. And this was a little bit of a scaled back version of the B2. Namely, it returned to using Contact 5 reactive armor. It had a further improved engine for even greater mobility. This is the version that can really get up and go speed-wise. It had yet more advanced communications gear, interlinks and all that good stuff. Improved night vision and other fire control devices. And again, a further updated gun that could use the newer controlled missiles. And this time, beginning around 2013, the Russian army would bite. They would order several of their existing T-72s to be updated to the standard. And I don't know exactly how many, sorry, but they were in service by 2013-2014 because in 2014, when Russia was denying being directly involved in Ukraine, they claimed that the T-72s that were fighting on the rebel side were all taken from Ukrainian stocks, but then photographs revealed a 72B3 or 72BM in rebel hands, and Ukraine would not have had those, so it had to have come from Russia. So some were used there and then. Now, I don't believe this was deployed to Syria, but I could be wrong. But several are in service today, and we're seeing them being used in Ukraine today. And yet again, Ukraine also has a number of T-72s of different varieties and stripes and whatnot. So it's very possible, yet again, as it happened in 2008 and even in 1990 with Kuwait and Iraq and other places, it could be T-72 on T-72. And more importantly, the whole design competition thing, it seems like these guys had the final laugh because the T-90 really could just be classed as the updated T-72. And the T-80U was kind of the final gasp of what started with the T-64, you could say. Certainly the T-80B. It'll be interesting to see where Russia goes next with their tanks. They have plans, but you know how plans go. So here we are, lined up as we close out the video. We've got the early Russian 72A and the export Iraqi 72A, then the B, and then the T-90, since I don't actually have a 72BM, 72B3. This will have to do. Need to look for one. It's actually, I looked, there are not very many T-72 models and 172 scale diecast on the market at the moment. Kind of a shame. You'd think there would be more, but the Forces of Valor is out of print. It looks like a lot of the Model Collect aren't available, and the Eagle Moss Fabry, not seeing any of those. And so the only ones I really saw were the Atlas Altea pattern, which are actually quite nice. If you like weighted models, this one is plenty heavy, that's for sure. It's just a good workaday tank. Simple, dependable, easy to keep running, not very fuel intensive, not very ergonomic or fancy for the drivers, not a lot of computer systems, not a lot of automations outside of the loader itself. But it gets the job done and works in a wide range of environments, from the very cold to the hot, the dry, the wet. A very good Soviet-era tank. And even though they managed to pull it from the second generation MBT into being a third generation MBT, it is dated and it is out of production. So eventually it will be phased out. But for now, it's still something to be reckoned with, especially for lighter armored vehicles and, other things. Aside from going up against another modern MBT, it can do quite a bit. Yeah, and now we've kind of wrapped back around to the T-90 where we started this journey. So what do you think? What's kind of your favorite of these tanks? Let me know in the description. And again, sorry if this was a little bit of a general overview video, but there's only so much I want to go into with this at one time. We can always revisit though. Well, this is Misha. I greatly appreciate you tuning in. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And I'll catch you very soon next time.